Here we go. All right. Well, hello, everybody. I am probably in Spain by now, and I am just excited to be talking about the ecological approaches to student development to you all via the computerized version of me. So um, let's take a look at the ecological approaches to student development. All right. So I really liked this excerpt from the book. It says, ecological approaches are not intended to explain, for example, the ways that multiracial students identify themselves or how lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, LGBT, identified changes over time. Rather, ecological models provide a way of understanding how students interact with campus environments to promote the development of racial or sexual orientation identities. So it's all about that interaction with campus environments. And hopefully, as we go along this presentation, you'll start to get sort of that idea of how the ecological approach really does connect with campus environments and the student affairs approach. So there's three major bodies of ecological approaches. There's human ecology, developmental ecology, and campus ecology. And we're going to talk about each one of these. So let's start with human ecology. Again, I like this quote. I think it did a really good job of sort of summing up what human ecology is. So human ecology represents a way of looking at the interaction and interdependence of humans as individuals, groups, and societies with the environment. And that's on page 159. And this picture is actually from a pre-orientation trip for outdoor adventures. So as I was going along in this presentation and reading this chapter, I was really thinking about how the ecological model connects to my work in outdoor adventures. So human ecology, again, this is another quote that I really liked because the foundation is really important for human ecology. So the quote is, the foundation of this theory rests in understanding a family or other social unit as an ecosystem. So I think those words are really important, family or other social unit as an ecosystem. And there's sort of two large parts the way I see it with human ecology. So part one has to do with adaptation to environment for survival. So this whole concept is just humans adapting to their environments, and this can be applied just as easily to students in campus environments. And so, I mean, this could be anything like Darwinism. I think about the giraffes who have survived over time, are the ones with the longest necks, and that's, theorized to be the way because the taller giraffes could reach the higher branches and therefore eat more and live, and those genes are passed on. Well, in a similar but also different way, and that's sort of a weird analogy because it happens faster with students. Using the immediate surroundings, humans adapt, and we get climatized, and we'll kind of make a connection to that in a larger picture later this presentation. So part two then is ecosystem location. So there's three parts to this. There's a lot of subparts throughout these chapters. So the three of these are human-built environments. These can be things like residence halls and how they affect you. So are you in a single bedroom? Are you in a double? Did you stack your beds? What are your physical human-built environments, and how are they affecting you as a student or as a human being in your development? So the second part of that is sociocultural, and what this has to deal with is, so yeah, the sociocultural aspect is shaped by family income, cultural backgrounds, and commitments to academics, athletics, and work, things like that. And if you remember from the book, they give the example of the two friends, and one of the friends is an athlete, and so that student would have a very strong commitment to her athletics, and the other student sort of has a cultural background that really has her want to do well in school and get a good job. So those things also affected her. And finally, there's the physical, biological aspect of human ecology, and I really like the example that they used in the book too. They talked about how the two girls were struggling in finding connection or agreement on something like who's shoveling the snow off the driveway tonight, or how hot should we keep the room. So these things can also affect that human ecology aspect, and I think that they're easy to forget sometimes, but when the room is 100 degrees and you want to cool it down, I think you start to remember those pieces of the physical, biological environments, and so forth. So, next slide. So what we're going to do now is there's a stepbrothers example, and I might have to email this in, so I'll see once I go through this entire presentation if it works or not, but I'm going to play this clip from Step Brothers, and I want to give a warning that there's some pretty explicit language. If you all haven't seen Step Brothers before, it's pretty ridiculous. So what I want to have happen is either I'll play this video if it works, or I'll send in the video to Matt, and if somebody could press play and you all could watch the video, and then you can pause this presentation while you're watching the video, and then just come back together and see what connections you can make from the things that the Step Brothers are going through. So Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly, they're new roommates. If you haven't seen the movie, their parents, they're like 40-year-old men, and their parents are divorced, and they get together, and both of these men are sort of struggling to find their place in the world, and they become roommates unexpectedly when their parents get married, and so this is sort of a fun scene. So which of the ecological components are you seeing at play here? Okay, well, I hope that was fun for you. So now we're going to go on to developmental ecology. This quote really helped me get my head around the difference between human ecology and developmental ecology. So the quote is individual focused rather than the cultures in which they're embedded. So this theory is really focused on the individual and sort of their surroundings rather than the surroundings that are embedded around that person. So we'll try to make more sense of that as we go through. So developmental ecology was conceptualized by Yuri Bronfenbrenner. Took me a while to be able to get to say that name correctly. Yuri Bronfenbrenner introduced the ecological systems theory in 1979. He was born in Moscow in 1917, and although he died in New York, so he is an American psychologist amongst many other things, but what he did was he explained growth and development in early childhood. So this theory is just as easily applied to college students. So we're going to take a look at Yuri Bronfenbrenner's developmental ecology model. So Yuri Bronfenbrenner took Kurt Lewin's equation that we looked at earlier, where Kurt Lewin said behavior is a function of the interaction of the person and the environment. And Yuri flipped that and said development is a function of the interaction of the person and the environment. So we're really looking at development here. Something to add is this theory added a way to look inside the interactions between individuals and their environments to see how and why outcomes may occur as they do. And that's from our book as well. For example, I really like this example from the book. Whereas racial identity development models focus on the outcome, racial identity, an ecology model may help explain how that outcome occurs as an interaction of person and environment. And I'll say that one more time because I think it's pretty profound. Whereas racial identity development models focus on the outcome, racial identity, an ecology model may help explain how that outcome occurs as an interaction of person and environment. All right. So there's four main components of this theory, of Bronfenbrenner's theory, and the interaction of them all. So we're going to look at process, person, context, and time. So let's look at process first. For our student affairs folks, I know that we also have some academic affairs people in the room, but for the sake of our class, for student affairs folks, this connects to Aston's theory of involvement, Sanford's challenge and support theories, and I really like to think of process, the component of Bronfenbrenner's theory, as the it. So process forms is forms of interaction between organism and environment, and these forms are called proximal processes. They operate over time. So just like some of our other +1 staging models or scaffolding, Bronfenbrenner suggests that the process of developmental ecology is buffered appropriately, so not to overwhelm the individual. So again, it's that challenge and support idea. You can't push students too hard, you can't support them too much, you got to find that sweet spot. So and then this is the core of Bronfenbrenner's theory, and we'll start to make more sense of this a little bit later when we look at the theory as it relates to the other parts of things. So I just drew this little graph, and it kind of shows you that this is chronological, and this is the process portion of everything. Okay, so the next part of this model is person, and I think of this as the word you. It just helps me to give, even though that these are already one-word parts of the model, it helps me to think of process as the it and person as the you. So this is the how and what of the person-environment interaction. The students' attitudes are going to be a large portion of the development, and we'll look at here some of the developmentally instigative characteristics. So there's four types according to Bronfenbrenner. One, that's those that invite or inhibit responses from the environment. The second one is attributes of selective responsivity, how individuals explore and react to surroundings. The third one is structuring proclivities, and that's sort of how individuals engage or persist in increasingly complex activities that are key to development. And finally, directive beliefs. So this is around agency, how individuals experience agency in relation to their environment. So all of these components are tied in with the person, and it's a really large part of the developmental model because you have to have the person there to engage in everything. So next, okay, so context. This one really helps me reframe the difference between human ecology and the developmental ecology models. So context gets the most focus in the human ecology model, where the person gets the most focus in the developmental ecology model. So that's just a good frame, but the context is still relevant in this model. So like I was saying, the person is the center of this model with four levels of context all around, and you're going to get really familiar with these four systems. So there's the microsystem. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. There's the mesosystem, the exosystem, and the macrosystem. Sorry, those last slides got a little bit jumpy. Let's move on. So let's talk about microsystems. So microsystems are those people in our lives that we have direct and immediate close contact with. So these could be people like parents, coaches, best friends, people like that. So microsystems are a pattern of activities, roles, and interpersonal relations experienced by the developing persons, students in our case, in a given face-to-face setting with particular physical, social, and symbolic features that invite, permit, or inhibit activity in the immediate environment. And that is straight from Bronfenbrenner. So what's mesosystems then? Well, mesosystems are the links of all of those different microsystems in our lives. And this is particularly pertinent in college settings because whereas in high school, some of these different environments or some of these different microsystems may have been a little bit more secluded or off in their own little world, typically for traditional college students, a lot of these things come to the same place. So your best friend is in the same place that you're living, and if you're on a sports team, your coach is in that same area, and your best friend might have communication with your coach and might have communication with your teacher. So a lot of these things are constantly interacting. The next part is exosystems, and there's a really good example in the book of the student who's on the sports team, and exosystems are those systems that don't contain the individual directly, but those systems still affect that individual. So the person from the book, the athlete, they talked about how this athlete is really affected by the decisions of the NCAA. So all of the policies that the NCAA are making affect that student, but that student's never most likely met anybody who works at the NCAA. So it's really interesting how many areas that this could pertain to students. And some of these might be like the people in a college setting who are making some of the larger policies. Maybe it's somebody in the history department who's the head of the history department and comes up with specific learning outcomes. And if I'm a student who's majoring in history, now everything that I'm learning is directly affected by the head of the history department, and I might never meet the head of the history department. So next, let's talk about macrosystems. So the macrosystems are the most broad system of context where patterns emerge. So these are things like cultural values, customs, political systems. And from the book, it says that macrosystems, they consist of overarching patterns of micro and meso and exosystems, an ecosystem's characteristic of a given culture, subculture, or other extended social structure, with particular reference to the developmentally instigated belief systems, resources, hazards, lifestyles, opportunity structures, life courses, options, and patterns of social interchange that are embedded in such overarching systems. So essentially, these are the largest areas that can affect an individual. So as an American, we're embedded in a lot of cultures, and some of those come from the macro level where we're just sort of born into them, and larger than our college, the fact that it's even an expectation to go to college or the funding for college, all of these things are part of the macro system. So what? I really like this quote because it helped me kind of get a so what feeling for macro systems, and the idea is college going, that is, who goes to college, who goes to what college, is shaped by the macro system, as well as the socio-historic influences related to economics, the workforce, and societal values. So this kind of touched for me on a part that I'm always thinking about, and that's who has access to college. So that's a really good example of the macro system. And when we think about who has access to which college, and again, like who's going to Ivy League colleges, those are all questions that revolve around the macro system, and that's where we're going to be seeing a lot of these cultural values being challenged but also developed. So another sort of the final piece to Bronfenbrenner's theory is time, or the chronos system, and I think of this as when. So again, we're with the micro, mesos, and macros. So micro time. This refers to continuity versus discontinuity in the proximal process. So again, this sort of range of time that's happening for a student, these small interactions of everything, these little events in each student's life that happen in the developmental stages, these are considered microtime. And mesotime is the linkings of all of these episodes that people go through in their life. So when you have something that happens in your developmental model, good interaction or something, the fact that you would have maybe one interaction like this every 2 weeks versus every 2 months sort of has to do with mesotime, because these intervals are how we track the development of each student, or how a student tracks their own development. And macro time, that deals with the changing expectations and events in the larger society. These can be either inter or intragenerational. So this could be how we track student development over their lifetime, over a large period of time in their life, or it could be what that development looks like from generation to generation. That might have to do with diversity on a college campus. That might have to do with little things that change the larger systems of the ecology of a campus. So what? Again, I liked this quote. I thought it helped sum up that final macro time idea for me. That was a little hard for me to grapple. And the quote is, "Time is what enables educators to see growth, change, development, and stasis in college students." So over time, that's the only way that we're going to really be able to see the idea of development playing out. If we don't have time, all of these are just isolated events, and we don't have anything to base any growth off of. So in regards to college students, so another one of these quotes from the book, they pointed to the timing of family events, birth of sibling, parents' divorce, family move, in a young person's life, and the timing of college attendance. For example, immediately after high school, returning after working for a time, as instances of time playing a role in development. So again, this looks at the idea of who goes to college, when, and why, and it all has to do with the chronos system. So I really think that this is a sort of a piece that might get a little bit forgotten since it is on the outskirts of this model, but it really is important because it gives not only an idea of each individual's development over time, but why students are where they're at in the developmental ecology model. So let's move into my activity. So my activity is based off of something called Web of Life. And what I want you all to do is Matt should have my P cord that I gave him from last class. So if Matt can grab that P cord, if you need to look for it a little bit, you can pause and I will be ready for you when you come back. So once Matt has the P cord, I want everybody to get in a circle and I want everyone to be touching shoulders in this circle. So get really, really close. Hopefully this is okay with everyone in terms of personal boundaries. It's okay if it's not. Please feel free to sit out. But it's a really interesting activity, I think. So I got this book, this Web of Life activity from a book called the Systems Thinking Playbook. I'm sure some of you may have heard of it before. It's a book that's filled with activities to help groups sort of get an idea about systems thinking. And I think it's really relevant to our Leadership 550 class. I missed it this week, but I'm sure there were some interesting things that went on. So what I want to have happen, and Matt, I know that you're not in Leadership 550, but I'm sure you have at least a little bit of ideas about situations that have conflict going on in them. And I want this activity only to last about 5 minutes. So we'll try to go within that time frame. So everybody stands shoulder to shoulder, and one person start with the entire ball of P cord in their hands. Okay, and once you have somebody who's holding the P cord in their hands, I want that person to give an idea about one of the many influences and what contributes to the feeling in Leadership 550. So what types of things are going on? I want to look at really specific, isolated variables, and every person in the circle is going to represent different variables and more than one variable. So it's okay if you get this P cord more than once. So what's going to happen is, again, the first person who's holding the P cord, if you could identify one variable that is sort of contributing to the overall culture in Leadership 550, or for Matt, just kind of think about a time that you were maybe in a situation that was a little bit stressful for you, and you can also just say a variable that contributed to that scenario being stressful. And so one by one, once you get the P chord, you can give an example of a variable that contributed to that. So first person might start off by saying time pressure. That's a contribution to the room and how it feels a little bit stressful for me. And once you say that, then you get to choose somebody else in the circle who has another variable of why the room feels the way that it does. And you keep passing this P chord around until everybody has had the P chord once. And the P chord, if I didn't make myself clear, is that big ball of yarn looking stuff that you have. So after each person's had that variable, it should be at the final, the P chord should be at the final person, and I would like that person to suggest how their variable that they just said relates to somebody else's variable in the circle. And once you've done that, walk the P chord or throw the P chord, however you want to do it, to that person so that you start to kind of see this web forming. And once you start to see everything sort of connecting and how all these different variables influence each other, you will kind of get the idea of just how many things are at play within the system in Leadership 550 or any dynamic that you're looking at. And so what my hope is for you all is to just have a quick 2-minute discussion about the connections you see between your experience in Leadership 550 and the connections between the systems that we've been talking about throughout this presentation. And moreover, the systems, how this applies to college students and being a student at a college, and how that has to do with all of the different systems at play and what that could mean for you as a student affairs educator and what that could mean for the students on campus. Okay, so you might need to pause here because you might need to get back to your seats. And when you're ready, you can just press play again and we'll talk about campus ecology. Okay, so campus ecology. So this is sort of the take home for all of this developmental ecology, human ecology, everything. How does it apply for us? So I'll read this quote from the book about campus ecology. So campus ecology, the study of the relationship between the student and the campus environment, incorporates the influence of environments on students and students on environments, as well as focusing on the transactional relationship between students and their environment. So this really looks at how the environment and the student and vice versa affect each other. So just be thinking about where you see that on this USD campus. So let's look at sort of the theoretical foundations behind campus ecology. And this is a picture of a law professor teaching, just in case you were curious, at USD. So the theoretical foundations for campus ecology were started by NASPA people, the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators, in 1978. And they offered campus ecology theory for designing learning environments. So that's a possible use of this ecology developmental model. And they based this theoretical foundation on Walsh's 6 theoretical foundations for campus ecology. And we're going to talk about those now. So the first one is Barker's behavior setting theory. And in essence, what that is people behaving certain ways because of their environment, even when it isn't in line with their personality. So this is sort of an idea of just grasping why students act the way that they do. And the idea again is that people are behaving, they're behaving this way because they think it's expected of them based on their environment. So again, be kind of thinking about where you might see this on the USD campus or on any college campus for that matter. So another one that plays into the campus ecology and Walsh's 6 theoretical foundations for campus ecology is the subculture approach. So the subculture approach assumes that individuals will find and join subcultures with values, attitudes, etc. like there. So this might look like a fraternity where you know that you really want a strong sense of brotherhood or something, and so you look for a certain fraternity that maybe aligns with your values. And if you find one, if you're like, I'm not much of a drinker, and there's maybe a fraternity that has a reputation for being high drinking, you would steer away from that and find your subculture of a fraternity that doesn't drink. So next, we'd look at Holland's personality types. So these are very person focused. These personality types. Holland's personality types looks for matches between personality and environment. So development happens when this match is either very good or very bad. So either, we have a match. This fraternity, because I'm using that example, is perfect for me. So I grow in this campus ecology model. Conversely, or inversely, this might look like I joined a fraternity, I absolutely hate it, but now I'm pushing up against what my values are. So I'm really learning because this match is so bad. So something about this model is that it's either typically very good and affords development, or very bad and also affords development. So let's move on to number 4, which is Stern's need times press equals culture. So what this means is behavior is a function of the relationship between the individual needs and the environment, which is the press. So I liked this quote. It helped me grapple with it. Campuses tend to be populated by students whose needs match the environmental presses available. So just kind of let that sink in for a minute. Campuses tend to be populated by students whose needs match the environmental presses available. So let's move on to Moose's social ecological approach. So it says student behavior is an outcome of environmental perceptions, personal characteristics, and their interaction in a dynamic system. So what this means, at least to me, is that the student might look at their school as a really great school, or might look at their particular learning environment as a really great learning environment. And if the student is very positive, then they'll get an idea, then they'll be able to develop even more if they perceive their environment as really great. Now, if the student's a little bit more negative, then the student might react differently. What sort of differs the Moose's theory from Pervin's transaction approach is Pervin's transaction approach focuses on interactions of transactions between the individual and the environment. So, in other words, this approach has an emphasis on perceptions and reactions to perceptions. And this, to me, is different from Moose's social ecological approach, because this also not only has to do with the student's perception on the environment in which they're in, but also the perception on themselves. So if the student perceives themselves as optimistic, they might perceive their environment even differently. So there's yet another variable along the way. So implications and future direction. We talk about it in every chapter. And one of the strengths for this model is that it's flexible. So I really like this quote. It's flexible enough to consider equally well the developmental context of residential students, commuters, distance, and the online learners, though less may be known about their non-academic contexts than may be known about the context of face-to-face students and students of different ages, backgrounds, and life histories. So what I thought was really great about this ecological approach is that it is less sort of prescriptive of who they're talking about. It's not so much necessarily done on a study of white men at Harvard in such and such a year. Rather, it's just sort of a theory about looking at each individual case and each individual school, and it's more abstract in nature. So it hasn't been enduring in the student affairs world. And why is that? Well, it's non-developmental. It doesn't have a beginning. It doesn't have a middle. It doesn't have an end. There are no stages which makes it challenging, I guess, to think about or maybe utilize. So that's the next point. It's challenging to implement. The book talks about how Facebook may help to study peer groups, but there is concern with studying peer groups in that way because it's just I mean, I think the privacy level is a little bit strange, but also, I mean, Facebook is not necessarily representative of what the students are actually like in a face-to-face way. So it's really hard to get a more holistic look at students that way. And finally, it hasn't been enduring because of the fluidity of environments. So it's really hard for somebody, a student affairs professional who's working at USD. I shouldn't speak for everybody, but it would be for me working at USD really challenging to get a sense of the changing dynamics within the school that I'm embedded, because there's the story about the goldfish who are swimming in water, and somebody asks one of the fish, how's the water? And the fish says, well, what the hell is water? Well, I think it's sort of the same thing for me. Sometimes when you're embedded in a culture for so long, you kind of lose track of some of those nuanced changes. So maybe that's a reason why it hasn't been enduring, this model. So here are my questions for you all. Some of them are more complicated than others on the surface, but I think really thinking about it is challenging. So I think a conversation, trying to put some of these into practice would be really good. So my first question is, where do you see yourself in this model? Especially being in a new school for a lot of us. I know Alejandro, you've been at USD for a while, but I think for the rest of us, we all went to different undergraduate institutions, or for Alejandro, because you've been here for a while, where do you see yourself in this model, especially in regard to the environment? The second question I have is, does the ecological approach support or challenge any of the other theories that we've learned? Because it is a little bit more broad, and doesn't necessarily look at a specific group of students and didn't necessarily do research on a group of students, do you think it supports or shoots down any of those theories? And finally, what's missing from this model, if anything? And do you think it applies universally? And you can pause it here and move to the next slide whenever you want. All right, so this slide's just sort of a joke because we said micro, meso, and macro so much. Please rate the amount of fun you had during this presentation. Did you have a micro amount of fun? Did you have a meso amount of fun? Did you have a macro amount of fun? And finally, here are my sources. Thanks to Mark Cedar for some of the pictures and for coming in the other day. And here's a quote that I like. I ain't got time to bleed. Jesse Ventura. Yes, he was Minnesota's former governor and a former pro wrestler. Thank you, everybody, very much for letting me do my presentation this way. Hopefully, it wasn't as challenging to listen to as it was for me to try to give this whole presentation without an active audience. All right, talk to you later.